The city at night was a galaxy of artificial stars, and in its wealthy heart, nestled among steel and glass, was the Velvet Note. It was a place of low ceilings, darker wood, and the soft clink of expensive glassware. To the people who frequented it, it was an oasis. To Leo Vance, it was a line on a spreadsheet. He owned it, but he didn't know it. Leo lived in a constant state of low-grade thunder. His mind was a browser with too many tabs open, each one a deal, a contract, a problem to be optimized. At 38, success had gifted him a corner office with a stunning view, but it had taken his quiet moments in return. He moved through the world like a man reading a manual for a machine he was already inside of, focused only on the next function, the next output. He came to the Velvet Note 3, sometimes for evenings a week, not for the music, which was usually a tasteful, forgettable jazz trio, and not for the atmosphere. He came because it was his, and in a booth at the back, under a focused pool of warm light, he could work without the interruptions of his own office. Here, the staff knew to leave him alone. They were a blur of white shirts and black waistcoats, efficient and silent. A raised finger would bring a fresh pot of coffee, a glass of mineral water, nothing more. Among these quiet movers was a woman who worked the late shift on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Her name was Alara. If you had asked Leo about her 2 hours ago, he would have struggled. He might have said, the one who does the books, and then moved on to a more pressing thought. She was in her late 20s, with a calm face that seemed to observe more than it revealed. She didn't work the floor with the servers. She arrived later, after the dinner rush, and slipped into the small office behind the bar. Leo's interaction with her was a broken record stuck on a single, polite groove. He would pack his laptop around 10:30. As he passed the open office door on his way out, she would often be sitting at the desk, a spread of invoices and receipts before her, bathed in the harsh glow of an old desk lamp. She'd look up. He'd give a short, tight nod, not quite meeting her eyes. "Good night," he'd say, the word automatic, like a password. "Good night, Mr. Vance," she'd reply, her voice always even, quiet. And that was it. He was gone, his mind already vaulting to the next thing, a conference call with Singapore, a review of quarterly projections. To him, she was part of the room's furniture, the human equivalent of the reliable printer in the corner. He never noticed the details. He didn't see the careful way she organized his often chaotic notes, or the slight frown of concentration she wore when reconciling the bar tabs. He certainly never saw her hands. If he had, he might have wondered about the faint, old calluses on the tips of her fingers, a texture that didn't quite match the handling of paper. He never noticed that her eyes, when she thought no one was looking, often drifted past the numbers on her screen, through the slightly ajar office door, and across the shadowy lounge to settle on one object, the grand piano. It sat on a low stage, a majestic, ebony creature. A single, slender spotlight hung above it, making its polished lid gleam like still, black water. It was the lounge's centerpiece, its pride and joy. Yet, for all its beauty, it was largely ornamental. The hired musicians used a sleek digital keyboard for their sets. The grand was for special, expensive events that rarely happened. Most nights, it just sat there, silent and perfect, a sealed treasure chest. One Thursday, running later than usual, Leo was poring over a contract on his tablet. The lounge was in that post-performance lull, the last few customers settling their bills. The waitstaff were resetting tables. As he often did when stuck on a clause, Leo rubbed his temples, his gaze wandering absently. It passed over the piano, and for a fleeting second, it caught Alara. She was standing by the office door, holding a stack of filed papers, perfectly still. She wasn't looking at the closing crowd or the cleaning staff. She was staring at the piano with an expression he couldn't place. It was a look of deep, almost painful longing, mixed with a familiarity that seemed out of place. It was the way someone might look at a childhood home they could no longer enter. It was so stark, so unguarded, that it briefly pierced Leo's mental fog. She looks like she's seen a ghost, he thought. But then his tablet pinged an email from his lawyer and the moment shattered. He looked down, and when he glanced back up, she was gone, vanished into the office. He dismissed it. Tired, he told himself. Everyone's tired. He finished up, his mind churning with legal jargon. As he stood and shrugged on his coat, he passed the office. She was back at the desk, head bowed over the ledger, the picture of mundane duty. The ghost of that strange look was gone, replaced by her usual, placid focus. "Good night," he said. The usual cue. "Good night, Mr. Vance," came the quiet reply he pushed out into the cool night air. the image already overwritten by the fresh problem waiting in his inbox. The silent piano, the employee with the momentary strange look, none of it mattered. They were background noise. What Leo didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have calculated, was the story in that room. He didn't know that the calluses on Alara's fingers were from a lifetime of pressing ivory keys, not paper. He didn't know that the ledger she balanced with such quiet efficiency was a prison of her own making, a cell she had willingly entered to keep a roof over her mother's head. He didn't know that the piano on the stage was identical to the one she had grown up with, the one that had been sold years ago to pay debts. To him, she was just the woman who did the books, a reliable, quiet function in the machinery of his empire. The idea that within her resided a world of sound, a torrent of locked-away music, of genius that had once made critics weep and then, cruelly, abandoned her. This was beyond the scope of his imagination. His world was built on visible metrics, unshouted declarations of success. The concept of something so profound being hidden in plain sight, so close to him every week, was impossible. But that was about to change. The thunder in his own life was building towards a storm, and soon, he would be desperate for silence, and in that silence, he would finally hear her. The storm broke on a Wednesday. It wasn't a dramatic, shouting kind of failure. It was worse. It was a slow, cold unraveling that ended in a sterile silence. Leo had been chasing the acquisition of a smaller, innovative company for 6 months. It was the perfect puzzle piece for his own, the key to the next 5 years of growth. The talks had been tense, but just yesterday, over a painfully expensive lunch, he had felt the final handshake in the air. He'd gone to bed with the specific, electric feeling of a win. The call came at 3 in the afternoon. The founder of the other company, his voice thin with apology, explained they were going in another direction. A larger, more established competitor had swooped in with a last-minute offer. There was nothing personal, of course. Just business. Just business. The words were like two dull knives. They meant 18-hour days for nothing. They meant explaining the loss to his board. They meant a sudden, gaping hole in the future he had already mapped out in his head. The thunder in his mind, usually a rumble of constant thought, became a single, deafening roar of white noise. He couldn't face his own office, with its view that now felt like a taunt. He couldn't go home to the empty, modern apartment that was just a place to sleep. His feet, moving on their own, carried him to the only place he owned that didn't feel like a stage. The Velvet Note. It was early, hours before opening. The heavy front door was locked. He fumbled with his keys, his hands unsteady. The silence inside was absolute and deep. The chairs were upturned on tables, the floor still slightly damp from mopping. The usual warm, amber glow was replaced by the gray, afternoon light seeping through the shuttered windows. It felt less like a lounge and more like a cave. That suited him. He wanted to disappear. He went behind the bar, ignoring the optics, and poured 2 fingers of a good whiskey, not bothering with a glass. He carried the bottle with him to his usual booth in the back, but didn't sit. He just stood in the darkness, the cool glass in his hand, and tried to breathe. The failure played on a loop behind his eyes, every conceded point, every shared laugh he now saw as manipulation, every detail he'd missed. He was so lost in the painful replay that he didn't register the soft, distant sound at first. It was a single note, clean, clear, and resonant. It hung in the dead air of the empty lounge like a drop of water in a deep well. Leo froze, his breath catching. An intruder? A cleaner? He stayed perfectly still, a predator instinct kicking in, listening. Another note followed, then another, tentative and spaced apart. Someone was testing the piano. A slow, searching scale began, up and down, the notes gaining confidence with each pass. It was someone familiar with the instrument, warming up. Then, it stopped. A moment of silence stretched. Leo was about to call out, to reclaim his space with the anger he couldn't direct at the vanished deal. But before he could make a sound, the music began. It wasn't the jazz he was used to hearing here. It wasn't background music. This was something else entirely. It was a waterfall of notes, a complex, tumbling cascade that was both incredibly precise and overflowing with a raw, aching sadness. It was a language of emotion spoken through melody, a story of something beautiful breaking. He recognized it, vaguely, from a distant memory, a piece by Chopin, he thought, a nocturne, but not as some smooth, background recording. This was alive. It was being born right here in the dark, slowly, silently. He put the whiskey bottle down on a table. He moved like a ghost himself, creeping from the deep shadows of his booth toward the source of the sound. The stage was at the other end of the room. As his eyes adjusted, he saw a figure silhouetted by the exit sign's faint red glow and the slivers of streetlight cutting through the window shutters. It was her, the bookkeeper. Elara. He stopped dead, hidden behind a pillar. His mind, just moments ago choked with financial calculations, went completely blank. He simply stared. She was transformed. The woman he knew was neat, contained, almost folded in on herself. This person at the piano was something else. Her back was straight but not stiff, flowing with the music. Her head was tilted slightly, her eyes closed. Her hands, those hands he had never truly seen, moved over the keys with a power and a grace that seemed impossible. They weren't just pressing buttons. They were speaking, crying, commanding. The piece swelled, filled with a turbulent, romantic sorrow, then fell to passages of such delicate softness it hurt to listen. He saw her shoulders rise with a deep breath as she leaned into a crescendo, the muscles in her forearms tense and then release. This was no hobbyist. This was a level of artistry he had only ever witnessed in concert halls, from people whose names were printed on programs. It was a kind of mastery that spoke of a lifetime of dedication. And she was here, in his empty bar, balancing his books. A wave of heat washed over him, followed by a cold chill of sheer astonishment. Who was she? How could this phenomenon exist in the quiet, unnoticed margins of his life? Every assumption he had made about her competent, quiet, unimportant shattered and fell away. He felt a fool, a man so blind he'd been standing next to a mountain and thought it was part of the wallpaper. The music began to wind down, the storm of emotion passing into a resolution that was peaceful, but deeply, irrevocably sad. The final notes were played so softly they seemed to evaporate into the dusty air. Before they reached him, her hands came to rest in her lap. She sat there for a long moment, head still bowed, as if waking from a dream or returning from a long journey. In that silence, Leo's own failure felt different. It shrank. It was just a deal. It was money and paper. What he had just witnessed was real. It was human spirit, raw and undeniable. The weight in his chest was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer just the crushing pressure of defeat. It was now mixed with a profound, disorienting wonder. He must have made a sound, a shift of his weight, an involuntary intake of breath. Her head snapped up. She turned, peering into the gloom. Her eyes, wide and startled, found his shadow by the pillar. The transformation was instant and heartbreaking. The musician vanished. In a flash, she was on her feet, the connection with the piano severed. Her posture crumpled back into the contained, careful woman he knew. She looked like a child caught with a forbidden toy. Mr. Vance. Her voice was a tight whisper, full of panic. I'm so sorry. The office was stuffy, and no one was here. I'm sorry. She began to quickly gather invisible things, as if to flee. The spell was broken. The lounge was just a dark room again, the piano just a piece of furniture. But Leo couldn't let it go back to normal. He couldn't unhear what he'd heard. He stepped out from behind the pillar, holding up a hand, not in accusation, but to stop her retreat. Wait, he said. His own voice sounded strange to him, rough from disuse and emotion. He cleared his throat. Please don't stop. For a long moment, the only sound in the lounge was the low hum of the refrigeration units behind the bar. She stood frozen, one hand still lightly resting on the piano for balance, as if caught between two worlds. Her face, in the dim red and gray light, was a mask of pure dread. It was the look of someone whose deepest secret, carefully guarded for years, had just been discovered. Leo realized his own posture was tense, like he was trying not to scare a wild animal. He slowly lowered his raised hand. I didn't mean to sneak up, he said, his voice softer now. I was here, in the back. I heard you playing. Her gaze dropped to the floor. I shouldn't have. I know it's not part of my job. I'll just go. She moved to step off the small stage. Please don't. The words came out more forcefully than he intended. He took a careful breath. I'd like to hear more, if you're willing. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the part of her that was the employee, who needed this job, warred with the part that had just been playing with such soul. The latter part won, but barely. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod and sank back onto the bench. She didn't look at him. She stared at the keys, her shoulders hunched. What was that? He asked, gesturing vaguely toward the piano. It was Chopin, right? Yes, she whispered. The nocturne in C minor. He ventured a few steps closer, stopping a respectful distance away, leaning against a table. You play it. You play it like you know it. I mean, really know it. This pulled a flicker of a sad smile from her. I've known it since I was 14. The silence stretched again, but it was a different kind now. It was an invitation. Leo, whose entire professional life was built on asking sharp, direct questions to get to the bottom line, found himself unsure of how to proceed. This wasn't a negotiation. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a deep, still lake, afraid a single wrong word would ruin the surface. Would you play something else? He finally asked. Anything, just don't stop because of me. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of a black key. Then, without a word, she turned back to the piano. This time, the piece was different. It wasn't the stormy sadness of the nocturne. It was something slower, more introspective, a gentle, rolling melody that felt like remembering a good dream. It was still complex, still played with that undeniable mastery, but it was quieter, safer. She was playing for an audience now, and she was holding a part of herself back. Leo listened, truly listened, for what felt like the first time in a decade. He wasn't thinking about his email, or his failed deal, or his next move. He was just following the story in the music. He watched her hands, the same hands that meticulously sorted his receipts, now conjuring entire worlds from the silence. The absurdity of it, the sheer hidden magnitude of it, settled over him like a heavy cloak. When she finished, she kept her hands in her lap, waiting. He paused. Can I get you some water, tea? I think there's a kettle in the back. She looked at him, truly surprised. The boss was offering to make her tea. Tea would be fine, thank you. He moved behind the bar, fumbling with the electric kettle and tea bags. The mundane task gave him time to think. When he returned with two steaming mugs, he set one on the piano for her and took a seat at a nearby table, not wanting to loom over her. She took a careful sip. Thank you, Mr. Vance. Leo, he said, please. I think after that, you can call me Leo. She nodded, but didn't say his name. She just held the mug for warmth. How? He asked simply, the question hanging in the air between them. How are you here? Doing the books. She took a long breath, as if preparing to dive into cold water. It's not a very interesting story. I doubt that very much. And so, haltingly at first, then with a quiet flow, she told him. Her name was Alara Mendez. She had been a child prodigy, not just a talented kid with lessons, but the real thing. By 10, she was winning national competitions. By 15, she was offered a place at a prestigious conservatory on the other side of the country. Her teachers spoke of concert stages in Europe, of recordings, of a future written in sheet music. The pressure was, she searched for the word, her eyes distant. It was like a constant weather inside me, a thunderstorm. Every performance was a test to prove I still deserved the label, the attention. The bigger the stage, the worse it got. Then, when she was 19, it happened. A pivotal recital, a stepping stone to everything. She walked out onto the stage, saw the sea of expectant faces, and her mind went blank. Not just nervous blank, a white, terrifying void. Her hands shook so violently she couldn't control them. The opening notes of a Bach piece came out as a jumbled, humiliating clatter. She fled the stage in tears and never went back. Stage fright, Leo said, not as a question, but as a realization, a cage. She corrected softly. They called it a psychogenic movement disorder. My own body, my own mind, locked the door on the one thing I loved. I tried therapy, different teachers, smaller venues. But the fear, it was like a monster waiting for me. The bigger the dream became, the bigger the monster grew. Around the same time, life intervened. Her father left. Her mother, a kind woman who had sacrificed everything for her daughter's lessons, developed chronic health issues. The medical bills began to pile up. The dream of the concert stage was already dead. Now the practical need to survive took over. I needed a job that was quiet, predictable. No surprises, no audiences. Numbers made sense. They didn't judge. They didn't panic. She gave a small shrug. I took bookkeeping courses. I was good at it. It was peaceful. This job came up. I liked being near a piano, even if I couldn't play it for anyone. Sometimes, when the place was completely empty, I would just touch it to remember. Leo stared into his tea. He thought of his own problems, the high-stakes stress, the fear of failure that drove him. It was a gilded version of her cage. His fears were about losing status, money. Hers were about losing her very voice, her language. He felt a deep, shameful understanding. So you just put it away? He asked. I had to, she said, and her voice was firm for the first time. It wasn't a choice between music and something else. It was a choice between a crumbling dream and keeping a roof over our heads. The music didn't pay the bills. The books did. She looked at the piano, then at him. I'm sorry you had to see that. It's a private thing, a memory. It doesn't have anything to do with my work here, I promise. I'm still good at my job. I know you are, Leo said quickly. That's not. I'm not worried about your job. He meant it. The idea of firing her was absurd. It would be like throwing away a masterpiece because you'd been using it as a doorstop. He stood up and walked slowly to the piano, looking at its polished surface. It seems like a terrible waste, he said. Not to her, but to the room. That's something so alive in you. Has to be a secret. It's not a secret, she said. It's just a past life. This is my life now, and it's a good one. It's honest. Her words were final, but her eyes, as they glanced at the keys, betrayed her. They held a love so profound it was a kind of grief. Leo made a decision then. It was impulsive, uncalculated, unlike anything he'd done in years. Would you make a deal with me? He asked, turning to face her. She looked wary. What kind of deal? Once a week, after closing. You stay, you play. Not for a crowd, just for me. I'll be the only one here. No pressure, no expectations. You can play whatever you want, or nothing at all. Just let it not be a secret. Let it be a part of this place, even if it's just for an hour in the dark. He paused. I'll pay you for your time, of course. Extra hours. She studied him, looking for the catch, the angle. Why would you want that? He thought about his failed deal, the hollow feeling in his chest. Because I think, he said slowly, that I need to hear it, and I have a feeling you might need to play it. For someone who isn't going to judge, or demand an encore. Just listen. Elara looked from him, to the piano, and back again. The war inside her was visible. The fear was an old, familiar wall, but the offer a chance to play, freely, without the monster of an audience was a tiny, unexpected door in that wall. Finally, she gave a single, small nod. Okay, she whispered. Once a week, okay. The first Thursday after their agreement felt, to Leo, like preparing for a strange and important meeting. He told his assistant to block out his late evening, a move so unusual she'd asked twice if he was sure. He felt a low thrum of nervous energy, not the bad kind from work, but the kind before seeing something you know will be special. At 10:30, he shooed out the last of the staff, flipping the lock on the front door himself. The lounge was quiet, still holding the faint, warm smell of the evening coffee, polished wood, and the ghost of perfume. He didn't sit in his booth. Instead, he took a chair at a small table near the piano, off to the side, where he wouldn't be in her direct line of sight. Elara emerged from the office, not in her usual neat work blouse, but in a simple, soft-looking sweater. She looked at him, then at the piano, her expression unreadable. She gave him a small, formal nod, like a doctor about to begin a procedure, and sat down. For a full minute, she did nothing. She just sat with her hands in her lap, breathing slowly. Leo fought the urge to fill the silence, to say something encouraging. He just waited. Then, she began. It was not a grand piece. It was a series of gentle exercises, scales and arpeggios that flowed into one another like water over smooth stones. It was the sound of someone reacquainting themselves with an old friend in front of a visitor. Gradually, the exercises melted into a simple, beautiful melody by Satie. It was spare and clean, and in its simplicity, he heard a fragility that was more moving than any dramatic flourish. When the last note faded, she kept her eyes on the keys. That was. Leo started, then stopped. Thank you, she nodded again, still not looking at him. Next week, she asked, already starting to rise. Yes, he said. Next week. And so, it became their ritual. Thursday nights, after the world outside had moved on to clubs or late-night diners or sleep, the Velvet Note became a different place. It became a temple with a congregation of one. Leo learned to listen in a way he'd forgotten. He learned the difference between a piece she was playing from memory, which flowed like a second language, and one she was reading for the first time from sheets she brought, where he could hear the slight pauses of thought, the moments of discovery. He learned that her shoulders relaxed when she played Debussy, as if the impressionistic music felt like home, and that her back straightened with a proud, old ache when she tackled the more severe structures of Bach. He never clapped. Applauding felt wrong, like rating a sunset. He would simply say, "That was incredible," or sometimes just sit in the following silence, which was now a comfortable, shared thing. Slowly, the employee boss wall continued to crumble. One week, After a particularly playful piece by Mozart, he let out a genuine, surprised laugh. She turned, caught off guard, and for the first time, she smiled back. It was a small, real smile that lit up her whole face, and it vanished quickly. But he'd seen it. He started making tea for them both beforehand, learning she liked green tea with a bit of honey. They began to talk a little, in the spaces between music. Short, safe things at first. He told her the story of how he'd bought the lounge on an impulse, seeing it as a solid investment, not for love of music. She told him about her mother's love of gardening, how their small balcony was a jungle of herbs and flowers one night. After a stormy piece by Rachmaninoff that left them both breathless, he asked a question that had been nagging him. Do you ever recompose? Your own things? She looked down, twisting a thread on her sweater. I used to, scribbles, ideas, but it felt pointless. Like writing a letter you'll never send. It wouldn't be pointless if you played it, he said quietly. She didn't reply, but a week later, after playing her usual selections, she paused. Her hands hovered over the keys, uncertain. This is something. It's not finished. It's just a fragment, and she played a minute of the most beautiful, haunting original melody Leo had ever heard. It was like seeing a glimpse of her inner world, raw and unedited. When she finished, she looked terrified, as if she'd just confessed a crime. Elara, he said, using her name for the first time in these sessions. His voice was thick with emotion. That's you. That's the real thing. Something shifted in her that night. The fear didn't vanish, but it made room for something else. Trust. Seeing that trust. Leo made his second impulsive decision. He called a contractor. In the storage room behind the office, a cluttered space full of old furniture and supplies. He had a small, soundproofed room built. It wasn't fancy. It had good acoustics, a comfortable chair, a simple recording setup she could use with one button, and a high-quality digital piano he had researched for days. He didn't tell her. He just led her to it one Thursday after her playing. She stood in the doorway, speechless, her hand over her mouth. It's not a gift, he said quickly, before she could protest. It's an investment in the atmosphere of this place. Good music in the walls. Think of it as a creative studio for whenever you want. No one will ever bother you in here. You can play, compose, record those fragments, or just sit. It's yours. Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. She walked in, running her fingers over the smooth surface of the new piano. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, he said. Just use it. The following weeks, he'd sometimes arrive early on Thursday and hear the faint, muffled sound of the digital piano from behind the soundproof door. She was exploring. She was creating. The woman who balanced his books was slowly, tentatively, embracing the artist she had locked away. Their conversations deepened. She asked him, one night, why a tech entrepreneur was so interested in a dusty old lounge. He found himself telling her about the constant noise in his head, the pressure to always be on, to perform the role of the successful founder. He told her, haltingly, about the big deal that had fallen through, the one that had brought him here that first night. I thought that failure was the end of something, he admitted, staring into his tea. But listening to you, it's like it quieted the noise. It put things in perspective. My problems are just problems. Your music is a truth. She listened without pity, which he was grateful for. We all have our cages, she said simply. Yours just has shinier bars. He laughed, a real, deep laugh. It felt good. One Thursday, she didn't play from the classical canon at all. She played a soulful, intricate arrangement of a popular film theme, then a jazz standard that swung with a rhythm that made him tap his foot. You can play anything, he said. Amazed. Music is music, she said with a shrug, but she looked pleased. They had built, without ever naming it, a fragile bridge between two islands. He was no longer just her boss. He was her sole, steadfast audience. She was no longer just his employee. She was the keeper of a beauty that was slowly healing parts of him he'd neglected. The Velvet Note, for 1 hour a week, was no longer a business. It was a sanctuary, and neither of them knew that the outside world was about to knock on its door. The anniversary of the Velvet Note's opening was always a big event. Leo usually treated it as a necessary networking function, a room full of investors, partners, and local dignitaries to be schmoozed. This year, he'd been so absorbed in other things he'd barely planned it, leaving the details to his manager. The lounge was transformed. Every table was full. The air buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of a dozen conversations about stocks, real estate, and politics. A hired jazz trio played upbeat, inoffensive tunes from the corner. Leo moved through the crowd, wearing his public smile, shaking hands, accepting congratulations on another successful year. But his mind was elsewhere. He kept glancing toward the office door. Ilara was there tonight, not as a performer, but working extra hours to help manage the chaos. He'd seen her earlier, looking strained in a simple black dress, circulating with a tray of canapes, expertly avoiding eye contact. This was her worst nightmare made real. A packed room, a sea of faces. He felt a pang of guilt. This world of noise and performance was the antithesis of their quiet Thursday nights. He wanted to tell her to go home, to hide in her soundproof room, but they needed the staff. As the evening wore on, the jazz trio took their scheduled break. The sudden drop to just crowd noise felt abrupt, leaving an empty space in the room. The manager, thinking to fill it, gestured for attention and presented Leo with a bland, oversized cake. There was polite applause. Leo gave a short, generic speech about community and good taste, his words feeling hollow as they left his mouth. He looked out at the smiling, expectant faces and saw only a wall. Then, his eyes found Ilara. She was trapped near the bar, holding an empty tray like a shield, her face pale. She was looking directly at him, and in her eyes, he saw a familiar, quiet panic. It was the same look she'd had that very first night he'd discovered her. The look of someone about to be crushed by visibility. In that moment, something clicked. The sight of her fear, contrasted with the shallow buzz of the party, ignited a quiet rebellion in him. These people were here for a show, but they had no idea what a real show was. They were celebrating a business, but they were missing the heart that had quietly started beating again within its walls. As the applause for his speech died down, instead of stepping aside for the cake to be cut, Leo walked over to the small stage. He picked up the microphone the band's singer had used. A ripple of curiosity went through the crowd. "Thank you," he began, his voice echoing slightly. The usual smooth confidence was gone, replaced by something more thoughtful, more real. "You know, we talk a lot about success in rooms like this. We measure it in years open, in revenue, in growth." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the confused, polite faces. But sometimes, the most valuable things aren't on the spreadsheet. They're the things we almost miss. The quiet talent that's right in front of us, every day. That makes the machine actually worth running. He could see his manager frowning from the side. He was going off script. He didn't care. This place has a soul, and it doesn't come from the decor, or the wine list, or even from me. He took a deep breath, his eyes finding Ilara again. She was frozen, shaking her head almost imperceptibly, begging him silently to stop. He gave her the smallest, most reassuring nod he could muster. "Tonight, instead of the usual, I'd like to share that soul with you, if she'll allow us." He extended his hand toward her, not as a boss, but as a supplicant. Every head in the room turned to stare at the woman with the empty tray. For Ilara, the world tunneled. The noise became a roaring silence. She saw the 100 pairs of eyes, the monster from her past, larger and more terrifying than ever. Her legs felt like water. Her breath caught. Every instinct screamed to run, to drop the tray and flee out the back door. But then she looked at his hand, held out across the crowded room. She saw his face. It wasn't the demanding look of a concert promoter. It was the same look he had in their Thursday sessions, open, expectant, but without pressure. It was the look of someone who had learned to listen. He wasn't offering her to the crowd. He was asking the crowd to witness her. There was a difference. A tiny, crucial difference. The room held its breath. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Ilara set the silver tray down on the bar with a soft clink. It was the loudest sound in the room. She smoothed her simple dress. Then, she began to walk. She didn't look at the faces. She kept her eyes on the piano, on the familiar, black expanse of it under the spotlight. It was her lighthouse. She passed Leo at the edge of the stage. He didn't say a word. He just lowered the microphone and stepped back, giving her the entire space. She sat on the bench. The familiar feel of it, the scent of the wood and polish, grounded her. This was her instrument. This was their sanctuary, even if it was now filled with strangers. She placed her hands on the keys, cool and familiar. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but to find the world she knew was there. She didn't play Chopin or Bach. She didn't play a standard. She played the first few, tentative notes of the fragment. Her fragment. The one she had composed in the safe room he'd built for her. The melody was shy at first, A question asked in the dark. Leo, watching from the shadows, felt his heart hammer. He recognized it. This was her most vulnerable gift. Then, something happened. As her fingers found the melody again, the fear didn't vanish, but it made space. The music grew. It swelled from that simple fragment into a full, beautiful composition. It had the soulful depth of the classics she loved, but it was entirely new, entirely hers. It spoke of longing and quiet joy, of hidden rooms and unexpected kindness, of a cage door not being broken down, but being gently, patiently held open. It was complex and breathtakingly beautiful, a story told in a language beyond words. The crowd was utterly mesmerized. The chatter, the clinking, it all died away. This wasn't background music. This was a force of nature. People stopped pretending to talk and simply turned to watch, their expressions shifting from curiosity to awe. Some closed their eyes to listen. A woman near the front had tears on her cheeks. Leo watched Alara. He saw the moment the transformation fully took hold. The tension in her shoulders melted. Her head lifted, just a little. Her hands moved with that same impossible grace he'd first seen in the dark. But now there was a new strength in them, a freedom. She wasn't playing for them. She was playing her truth, and she was allowing them to hear it. She had walked through the fire of her fear and emerged, not on the other side, but above it. When the final, resonant chord faded, she kept her hands on the keys for a moment, head bowed. The silence that followed was profound, thick with emotion. Then, the room erupted, not in wild cheers, but in a deep, thunderous, standing ovation. It was a sound of genuine respect, of wonder. Alara opened her eyes, looking out at the sea of standing, applauding people. For a second, the old panic flickered, but then she saw their faces. They weren't judges. They were witnesses, moved by something real. She looked over at Leo. He wasn't clapping. He was just standing there, his own eyes bright, giving her that same, small, proud nod. She stood, gave a modest, graceful bow, not the bow of a concert pianist to her fans, but a simple thank you from one person to others for listening, and walked off the stage. People reached out to gently touch her arm, to say thank you. That was incredible, but she moved through them in a daze, straight to the back office, seeking quiet. Leo found her there a few minutes later, sitting at the desk, her hands trembling slightly. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "I did it," she whispered, as if she didn't quite believe it. "You did," he said, his voice full of warmth. "And it was yours. All of it. It wasn't for them," she said, clarifying it for herself. "It was just a me. And they happened to be there." "Exactly," Leo said. He leaned against the doorframe. "You know, a few agents and a couple of arts patrons cornered me. They want your number. They're talking about recordings, small venue tours, composer residencies." The old fear flashed in her eyes, but it was weaker now, tempered by the reality of what had just happened. I don't know. You don't have to know anything right now," he said. "The door is open. That's all. You can walk through it, or you can just enjoy the view from here. The choice is completely yours. Your job here is yours for as long as you want it. The studio is yours. Nothing has to change unless you want it to." She looked at him, this man who had gone from a silhouette in a doorway to a keeper of her silence, to the first believer in her voice. The balance between them had finally leveled. They were no longer boss and employee, nor even just audience and artist. They were two people who had, in an unlikely way, helped each other find a missing piece. She took a deep, steadying breath. The trembling in her hands stopped. A small, real smile touched her lips. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time, the words felt too small for everything they held out in the lounge. The party had found a new, richer energy, but the heart of it was back in the quiet office, where the woman who was once just the bookkeeper finally understood she was, and had always been, so much more. The music was no longer a secret, and her life was no longer a score written by fear. It was a composition, and she was just beginning to play.